Welcome back to our series of audio lessons on the book of Esther. Today we'll look at chapter 6. But before we get into chapter 6, let's take a quick look at what's happened so far. In chapter 3, the villain of the Esther story, Haman the Agagite, has just been promoted to Grand Vizier, number 2 in the kingdom. Mordecai's refusal to bow before him enrages Haman, and he devises a plan to kill all the Jews. He deceives Xerxes about this certain people, and Xerxes allows Haman to issue a decree in the king's name for these people to be killed, destroyed, and annihilated. In chapter 4, sometime later, probably not too long, Mordecai learns of the decree and makes a mournful spectacle of himself, dressing in sackcloth and ashes and parading through the streets of Susa, ending up at the king's gate. Through go-betweens, he persuades Esther to go to the king to plead for her people. Who knows? We've talked about this Hebrew idiom, who knows? And he says to her, essentially, this is why you have become queen, just for this action. She calls for a 3-day fast among the Jews in Susa in preparation before going to the king. In chapter 5, the 3 days of fasting and prayer are completed. Although prayer is never specifically stated, it always accompanies fasting. Esther makes her appearance before the king. Winning favor in his eyes, he allows her entrance. That's always said about her. She won favor. We talked about the difference between finding favor, implying passivity, and winning favor, implying activity. I went through the book just to look at this. Whenever Esther has an encounter with anyone, Haggai, Xerxes, the text always says she won their favor. Whenever she approaches Xerxes, she always says, if I have found favor in your sight. Although this is normal court etiquette of addressing a superior, I think it speaks to her humility. She could have said, if I have won favor, but she doesn't. She always says, if I have found favor, as if she thinks she's done nothing to deserve or receive their favor. It's obvious from the 30-day absence from the king is not due to the fall in favor from Xerxes, as he shows great concern for Esther's presence. What troubles you? What ails you? He says. And an even greater desire to please her. Hyperbolically, a gift of up to half his kingdom is offered. Her request is simple. Please come to a banquet prepared for you and bring Haman. At the banquet, Xerxes again asks Esther her request and repeats his offer. It's simple again. Please, king, just come to another banquet tomorrow and bring Haman, and I'll tell you everything then. Haman's ego is greatly inflated by the evening with the king and the queen, and is just as suddenly deflated at the sight of Mordecai, still refusing to bow to give honor to Haman. Just the sight of Mordecai fills Haman with wrath. He may have wanted to kill him on the spot, yet he restrains himself and goes home. There he consoles himself with his wife and his friends. These friends are more like his advisors. Later in the book, they'll call him wise men. His list of accomplishments and riches bring him no satisfaction as long as Mordecai sits at the king's gate, meaning as long as Mordecai lives. They concoct a plan to get rid of Mordecai once and for all. Waiting for the edict to come into effect is just not good enough. He must die now. Prepare a gallows 50 cubits high and go tell the king to hang Mordecai on it. And then, that accomplished, go to the feast with Esther. Okay, let's start with chapter 6. We'll start with verses 1 through 5. On that night, the king could not sleep. He gave orders to bring the book of the memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, and how they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's young men who attended him said, nothing's been done for him. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, Haman is here, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. The chapter begins with that night. And the question is, which night? Well, it's the night after Esther's banquet. It would be a very eventful night. It was the night of Haman's ego-bursting encounter with Mordecai. It was the night Haman recalled all his glories to his wife and friends, yet with no satisfaction. It was the night the plan to hang Mordecai was formed. From further reading in the text, it's clear that it was the night at which the gallows were built on which Mordecai was to hang. It was a night in which several coincidences just happened to fall into place for Esther and the Jews. The pulpit commentary says, "It is among the objects of the writer of Esther to show how the smallest circumstances of life, those most generally regarded as left to chance, work together for the good to such who deserve well, and for evil as to such deserve evil." Ecclesiastes seems to echo this. In Ecclesiastes 9:11, "Again I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge. But time and chance happen to them all." Well, let's look at some of these coincidences that happened that night. Coincidence number 1, the king could not sleep. It just happened that the king could not sleep that night. Now, that in and of itself is not too surprising. Many of us have had sleepless nights. But why on this specific night could Xerxes not sleep? Maybe he was fretting over the affairs of state. Maybe he ate too much at the banquet. I know that I've overeaten before and not been able to sleep. Maybe after the pleasant evening with Esther, he was mad at himself for neglecting his queen for so long. Maybe the anticipation of the second banquet with Esther, and perhaps the anxiety over Esther's request, rolled over in his mind. Some of these, all of these, a combination, who knows? The Septuagint translation makes it quite clear exactly why he could not sleep. It says, "The Lord took sleep from the king that night." Elsewhere in the Bible, dreams are used to convey God's messages to someone. Here, it's insomnia. The king, who never sleeps or slumbers, wanted to keep Xerxes awake that night to tell him something. Coincidence number 2, the king's choice of entertainment. As king, he could have chosen any number of means of entertainment, musicians, singers, dancers, jesters. You've seen ads for phone apps that play a babbling brook or birds chirping or soft music to lull you to sleep. Instead of soft music to lull him to sleep, as Persian kings were apt to do, he just happened to choose to have the book of the records of the Chronicles. One translation calls it the book of memorable deeds. He wants that read to him. Maybe he thought the monotonous voice of the reader would put him to sleep. These would have been the exploits of the king in the official court records, much like reading the records of the House of Representatives. That surely would have put him to sleep. If you have insomnia, watch House proceedings on C-SPAN. Coincidence number 3, the selection of the book the king wanted to have read, the Chronicles. Surely he had other books in his library. There is disagreement on exactly how the reading proceeded. This being about the 13th year of Xerxes' reign, a single book would have been quite lengthy and not able to be read in one sitting. Some commentators think he may have had several volumes of books, one for each year of his reign. The verb read here is in continuous active tense, implies kept on reading, and only stopped when Xerxes questions about the account of Mordecai. It's probable that the reading was ongoing for a while until the foiled assassination plot was reached. Jewish tradition holds that when the reader opened the book to begin reading, the wind blew the pages to the account of Mordecai. The reader attempted to turn back to the beginning, but the wind blew again to open the book to Mordecai's section. You see, God wanted that section read. However, as a former criminal court judge friend of mine is fond of saying, that assumes facts, not in evidence. These would have been scrolls, not books with pages. Coincidence number 4. No reward had been given to Mordecai. Perhaps not remembering the exact details of the events, Xerxes asked what reward was given to Mordecai. No, more likely, the reader was reading something like, Mordecai foiled an assassination plot, and moved on to the next line when Xerxes stopped him and asked about the reward. You see, the reward given would have been included with the record of the deed. If it was there, it would have been reading, Mordecai foiled an assassination plot and received a year's tax relief for something such as that. It was a principle of Persian government that royal benefactors, and for his actions Mordecai would qualify, that they receive a royal reward and their names recorded in the scroll of the friends of the court. This was a way of maintaining loyalty. Great care was taken to ensure that the reward was settled. This time it had not been. To neglect the reward was a great breach of protocol and an embarrassment to the king. But, as in this case, better late than never. It just happened that Mordecai had not been rewarded 5 years ago. Why had Mordecai not been rewarded? Well, perhaps it was a bureaucratic oversight. No, I don't think so. Bureaucrats never make mistakes. Perhaps at the time the king didn't specify what should be done, relying on others to make the decision. So, nothing was done. However, had Mordecai been rewarded at the time, Xerxes would have been satisfied that all was well and proceeded with the reading. The critical events of this day would not have happened. Then, when Haman came to seek Mordecai's execution, the king may have allowed the execution to go forth. Coincidence number 5, Haman's timely arrival. It just happened that Haman arrived just as Xerxes was discovering the oversight. It was early morning, some commentators suggest even before sunrise, and the palace had begun to stir. The gallows had been built during the night, probably under Haman's supervision. Haman may have gone to the palace immediately afterwards and been there for some time waiting for Xerxes. You see, he had a to-do list to do that day, and number 1 on that list was telling the king to hang Mordecai. He wanted Mordecai's body on display as soon as possible. How might have Haman convinced Xerxes to hang Mordecai? Well, probably in the same manner as he got the edict to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the certain people. Something like, "Oh, king, there's a malefactor in the court. Don't mention who he is. One who does not obey the king's commands. Don't mention the command was to bow to Haman. It is not in your interest to allow this. Look, there are gallows prepared, and you just say the word, O king, and I'll take care of this for you." Coincidence number 6. Xerxes seeks counsel. When Xerxes asks who is in the court, he was seeking an advisor for advice on what to do. He never made decisions on his own. He certainly should have known how to reward loyal behavior. If not, he could have checked the chronicles as he was done in the past. So why seek counsel now? What if Haman had arrived 1 hour later? Perhaps Xerxes would have consulted with another advisor. If so, certainly a different honor would have been suggested, and another court official appointed to carry it out. In any case, Haman would not have been there to present his idea to the king, and would not have been tasked by Xerxes with following through on it. He would not have been humiliated, and his entire mindset would have been different. Let's look at verses 6 through 11. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Who would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the city square, proclaiming before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" And the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave nothing out that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai, and led him through the city square, proclaiming before him, "Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." In 1967, Paul Newman starred in a movie called Cool Hand Luke. It was set in the Deep South, Florida, I think. He was a petty criminal who had been sentenced to a certain time on a chain gang. Yes, they still had chain gangs back then. The nemesis of he and his fellow gang members was the gang captain, played by Strother Martin. He would capriciously inflict punishments on gang members for the slightest of supposed infractions. After the punishment was inflicted, usually a beating, He would stand over the crumpled prisoner and in his deep southern drawl say, "What we have here is a failure to communicate." Haman is about to have his own communication failure. As Haman arrives, and before he can make his request, the king immediately asks him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? This has been on Xerxes' mind since discovering the reading. Xerxes doesn't name the man, but in his presumption and sense of self-entitlement, Haman can think of no one else in the entire kingdom whom the king should delight in honoring more than he. He thinks this greeting from Xerxes, the man whom the king delights to honor, is a euphemism for Haman. You can almost see him letting that phrase sing in his mind, the man whom the king delights to honor. After all, he's number 2 in the kingdom, and he had received an invitation to Esther's royal banquet. You see, this is just the natural outcome from all of this. This is the next step. Xerxes has something big planned for me. Thus, Haman's communication failure. Abandoning all formal court etiquette, if it pleased the king, Haman gives his response. He didn't have to stop and scratch his head and think about it. He knew immediately what was to be done, almost as if he had rehearsed this scenario over and over in his mind. His response was the most extravagant he could think. Let him be attired in royal robes, those which had already been worn by the king, something like hand-me-downs. He was to be placed on a royal horse, again, a horse already ridden by the king, with royal saddlery. This had been some kind of drapery over the horse, like the jousting regalia you see in the movies with medieval knights, and complete with a crown for the horse. Now, some people doubt this, but there are reliefs that show a conical-shaped cap that placed on the horse's head. Then lead him through the city, proclaiming, "Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Nothing but the best for Haman. A similar display was given to Joseph after he interpreted the Pharaoh's dreams and was elevated to number 2 in Egypt. In Genesis 41, 40 through 43, Joseph is given the king's signet ring. He is dressed in fine linen garments with a gold chain around his neck. He rides in the king's second chariot with runners calling out before him, "Bow the knee." This was the height of impudence for Haman. Each of these actions, any of these actions by itself, without the king's permission, was a capital offense. Such a display would have been very similar to the king's own coronation, except for the man whom the king delights to honor stuff. The only item missing was the golden scepter. At first sight, and from a distance, the public might have thought this was the king himself approaching and prompting them to bow down. Maybe that's what Haman wanted. This also could have been misconstrued by the people as Xerxes naming Haman as his successor. Did Haman have eyes on the throne? Well, some people speculate that. He was number 2 in the kingdom. If anything happened to Xerxes, he would have been best positioned to immediately secure the throne, even ahead of Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes. You may remember the assassination attempt on President Ronald Reagan in 1981. During all the early confusion, then Secretary of State Alexander Haig said in a press conference, "I'm in control here." He wasn't. But should a similar situation have arisen, I think Haman may have taken steps to take control and not given it up. That might have included killing the entire family, including Artaxerxes and Esther. That had been a common practice in a coup. You see, he was a proud, vain, ambitious, and possibly psychotic man. Was second place good enough for him? As has been said, the hardest instrument to play is second fiddle. Haman's heart must be beating rapidly with anticipation. He's already changing his to-do list. Number 1 now, receive honor from the king. Number 2, hang Mordecai. Yeah. Number 3, go to Esther's banquet. Not so fast, Haman. Xerxes now declares all this, the robes, the horse, the proclamation, shall be done for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. And you, Haman, are the noble official to carry this out. Leave nothing out that you have mentioned. That's both a charge and a warning. Xerxes has no idea of the situation between Haman and Mordecai, no ideas about the edict covering the certain people. He doesn't even know who they are, but they include now the man whom he wishes to honor. He has no idea of the irony he just produced and the humiliation he has caused Haman. If the people were confused about the death edict, they were doubly so now. You see, the Jews are to be killed on the 13th of Adar, and now the king is honoring a Jew. According to one Jewish piece of art, the people were not the only ones confused. It depicts Haman's wife, Zeresh, thinking the roles are reversed, that is, Haman on the horse, Mordecai leading him, and she is seen dumping slop from a second-story window on whom she thought was Mordecai. It was instead Haman. There may have been a look of satisfaction on Xerxes' face. He has just rectified a 5-year-old problem. Haman may have felt gut-shot. The one he most hated is the one the king wishes to honor, and he must see to it. Surely there would have been some expression change, a blanching of the face, a reddening of the face, jaw-dropping, something to give away his emotional state. Wait, what? You've got to be kidding. Probably not. He was well practiced in duplicity, and freely expressing a negative emotion before an Eastern monarch was not done, especially if it was in response to the king's decision. No, a dutiful bow to the king and off to carry out the orders. You have to wonder how that all came about. What did Haman say to Mordecai as he took him to be dressed in the royal robe and as he placed him on the horse? Did he explain all that had transpired between the king and himself? How did Mordecai react? You have to feel a little sorry for Haman about this time. Almost. Maybe just a little. Nah. He was experiencing extreme self-inflicted humiliation, not only among the people of Susa. They would have not known the situation between Haman and Mordecai. They might not even known about the foiled assassination plot, and that's not something the king would want to broadcast. They may have remembered the 2 men being hung a while back, but that's about it. All they would have seen that day was an honor being bestowed upon one of the king's loyal subjects for a deed well done. But among those who knew the situation, those whose opinion Haman regarded most, especially his own, the humiliation would have been devastating. Let's finish the chapter, beginning with verse 12. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but you will surely fall before him." While they were yet talking to him, the king's eunuchs arrived to hurry Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. After a day of being paraded around the city in royal dress, on a royal steed with his arch nemesis proclaiming the king's delight, Mordecai must have been on top of the world. No doubt he's relishing the humiliation brought to Haman that day. Perhaps a fist pump or two to celebrate. Yes! What's that you say? No? Well, then what did Mordecai do? He went back to the king's gate. Back to work. No celebration, no end-zone dance, no rubbing in Haman's face, no trash talking, not even taking the rest of the day off. He just went back to work for the king. When he foiled the plot 5 years earlier, he received no reward. He seeks none now. All he received this day was a pony ride. All the pomp and circumstance of the day probably was a bother and an embarrassment to Mordecai. I think he really didn't care if a reward had ever been paid. He saw his act of 5 years earlier as one of loyalty to the king, one that any loyal subject would have done. He didn't need the recognition of the king for his deed. Haman's response was quite different. His to-do list had changed again. Receive honor from the king. No, scratch that. Get humiliated by Mordecai. Hang Mordecai. No, scratch that. Go home and cry to your wife and friends, and then go to Esther's banquet. After he returned to the palace, he ran home with his head covered. That's a sign of mourning. He didn't want to see anyone. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He didn't want to receive the honor of others bowing down to him. He wanted out of there as fast as possible. Whether the gathering with his wife and friends in chapter 5 was one of boasting or pity can be debated. What is for sure is that this one was definitely sad and humiliating. He relived this debasement to his wife and friends. If he was expecting solace, he was sorely mistaken. It was at the encouragement of his wife and friends that he had plotted to have Mordecai hanged that morning. They couldn't now say, "Shouldn't have done that." Instead, they do the next best thing. They sense a change in fortune, Mordecai rising in the king's favor, Haman falling, and they turn on him. Their tone seems to be, "I could have told you that," or "You had a feeling something bad was going to happen. Now you tell me? Where was all this sage advice before? Why didn't you caution me before encouraging me?" Well, of course, before they were stroking his ego. Now they think they see things clearly. And his wife's words to him are, "Haman, you're toast." He would surely fall before Mordecai. That he would fall doesn't necessarily mean that he would die. It might just mean a fall from favor from Xerxes and a demotion, perhaps something like junior gatekeeper under Mordecai. Why was all of this happening? Because Mordecai is a Jew. They see a bad omen in Mordecai being a Jew. But everybody knew he was a Jew before their advice to Haman. Mordecai admitted it to the other officials. Haman said it twice in the gathering in chapter 5. It didn't seem to bother them then. But now Zeresh concludes that the determining factor in Haman's impending fall was Mordecai was a Jew. Why did she conclude this? Maybe she thought since Mordecai had been honored by Xerxes himself, it would be unreasonable to allow Mordecai to be destroyed with the edict. Perhaps he'd be the only Jew spared. Maybe she knew about God's covenant with the Jews. Ancient societies didn't live in vacuums. They knew about what was going on in other parts of the world. Maybe she knew some Jewish history and knew that in spite of all the captivities and persecutions, the Jews always survived. None who had ever plotted against them had prospered long term. Maybe she knew there was some irresistible force, God, protecting the Jews. I don't know. But if Mordecai was of the Jewish people, Haman would fall. Did any of this, Mordecai's being honored, did any of this change the plight of the Jews? No. Xerxes was just rewarding a loyal subject, not elevating Mordecai. Mordecai went back to work at the king's gate. The edict was still in place, and Xerxes had no idea who would be killed, just a certain people whom he would be better off without. Haman's pride and hate for Mordecai kept him from swallowing this bitter pill and getting on with his business. Proverbs 16:18 says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." All this talk about not overcoming Mordecai only served to feed Haman's insecurity. And this insecurity bred paranoia. The king is out to get me. No, he wasn't. He was clueless. There's a knock at the door. The door is open, and there stands the king's eunuchs. "Excuse us, Lord Haman. We're here to escort you to Queen Esther's banquet." Flushed with fear and paranoia, he leaves for the banquet. Well, that'll do it for chapter 6. Next time, we'll look at chapter 7. Until then, may God bless you.